everyone. Okay, thank you for joining us on Saturday morning. It's 19th of June, marking the International Day for Elimination of Sexual Violence in War and Conflict. We are very excited and appreciative of having Associate Professor Tine Dolgopol join us as a speaker. And I will do a proper introduction of her in a minute. But let me just start by sharing the introductory slides, which I'm having a bit of trouble going to, because my screen says this meeting is being recorded and it's asking me to continue or leave the meeting. And I want to say continue, but my mouse is not letting me. Do we know how to fix this? This hasn't happened to me before.
Can you press enter?
Bingo, great, thank you. And now my slides aren't moving, which they were before we started recording. So apologies, everyone, do bear with me.
Can you retry?
Yeah, sometimes if you close screen share and then reopen it, it'll work a little bit better.
Okay, let me try that.
Yes, unfortunately, Zoom's got a few glitches to it that mean some of the options don't work as well as you might like.
Okay. The only thing I could do right now is stop video. My mouse doesn't move to the stop share button on Zoom right now. I might continue and see how I can go on the fly. So the way we will structure today is I'll just give a quick introduction to the day, why we decided to have the webinar today, and also introduce the speaker and the participating organizations. Participating organizations meaning the coordinators of today's webinar. But before we get on to that, let me start by acknowledging country of the First Peoples and the traditional owners on the lands with which we virtually meet. I'm in Melbourne, so for me, that's the people of the Wurundjeri and the Kulin nations. And having not acknowledged country, we would like to ensure that this session, which will be interactive and quite personal, is inclusive and as respectful as possible for everyone. We are talking about a topic of sexual violence during war and conflict, which can be quite emotionally taxing and sensitive and triggering for some people. So please do keep that in mind as you participate and raise questions. The webinar today comes to you by the efforts of 5 organizations combined, and we are in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, in New Zealand, in Australia, and in New Zealand. We have Friends of Comfort Women Sydney that hosts the Girl Statue in Sydney, Australia. We have the Melbourne Comfort Women Task Force based in Melbourne, of course, hosting the Girl Statue there. We have the group in Brisbane, and Dr. No, my apologies, I don't have the notes in front of me because it should be on the slides. Do you mind giving us the correct name of the organization?
Sorry. So yeah, the name of our association is 인생사모, 인권을 사랑하는 사람들의 모임 in Korean, and in English we call it Justice and Human Rights for All, based in Brisbane.
Fantastic, thank you. And the New Zealand group is called Koreans in New Zealand, Korean Kiwis for a Better Future. So 19th of June is the designated day by the United Nations to give awareness to sexual violence occurring in war and conflict. There is a UN page, a web page that I encourage you to have a look at. They have a snapshot summary of the prevalence of this happening around the world today. And they also have listed a number of key UN resolutions that have codified the political will of countries to eliminate this as a practice in our world. So I encourage you to have a look at that and remember 19th of June in the hope that we will eliminate this happening in the near future. So with that, I will introduce our esteemed speaker, Associate Professor Tine Dolgopol, who is a globally leading not only scholar but a practitioner of women's human rights in war and conflict in the legal field. So she is currently the Associate Professor in the College of Business, Government and Law at Flinders University. And since around 30 years or so of experience in activism, including in the 90s, she took an investigative research project that had her go to South Korea, North Korea, Japan, and the Philippines to interview the so-called comfort women. And in the 2000 Women's War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo, Japan, she was one of the co-chief prosecutors. And for that work, she was honored in the inaugural gender, I forget the full name. Again, it was
The Justice Legacy Wall.
Justice Legacy Wall in New York. So we are very appreciative to have you today. So over to you.
Thank you. I should just say that I'm an adjunct professor because I retired in 2014. And so now I'm an adjunct rather than a full associate professor. But that's by the by. As Anna said, she and I discussed this, and I decided that it was probably better to do a personal discussion rather than going through some of the legal issues, because at the moment, obviously, the main legal issues are between Japan and South Korea, the women in South Korea, in the South Korean courts, and I'm clearly not an expert in Korean law. And so I thought it best to stay away from that issue because there are other people who were better placed to be talking about it. So as Anna mentioned, I first became involved in this issue when I was asked by the ICJ to go and do what they would call an investigative mission and report. But what I want to start with on a more personal level is the title of the speech, as you can see, is Activism, Inspiration and Legacy. And so I'm going to start with the word inspiration because doing that work had a fundamental effect on my own life. But while we were doing that mission, Snehal, Paranjp and I interviewed somewhere between 40 and 50 women. So that meant that I personally was interviewing over 20 women. And one of the things—
I apologize greatly, but what I'm realizing now is we invited people to turn their videos on and we are recording, and we do wish to share this recording on a more public platform. So for anyone who is concerned about their privacy, feel free to turn off their videos. We will only record the 20 minutes of Professor's talk. So sorry to interrupt, but
No, that's okay. And those interviews, number one, many of those women had been interviewed previously. So, and they had begun to gain traction, but of course, we couldn't promise them that what we were doing would necessarily gain them better international recognition, but they were still willing to share their stories. And one of the things that I've talked about and written about previously is that as you were interviewing the women, you could just see in their eyes that they were reliving these experiences and that they were picturing themselves as the girls and young women that many of them were, because some of the women we interviewed were no more than 15, 16 years old when they were taken into those comfort stations. And it struck me that it was such an act of courage to be willing to relive your trauma in the hope, one, that it might have an effect generally on what was happening around the world, because of course this is at the same time of the Yugoslav conflict and all the reports on the sexual violence that are taking place in Yugoslavia, and that perhaps they might have some form of justice. Now, luckily, for all of us, the ICJ report did receive a huge amount of publicity at the time. It was picked up in Geneva by a huge range of journalists. And obviously that wasn't the only thing that led to publicity. But the reason for highlighting that and that word inspiration is it fundamentally changed for me the focus of my research and some of my teaching. So after doing that work, I actually introduced an elective topic on women's rights and the international protection of women's rights, and was able obviously to include the comfort women issue in that course. And I also then changed the focus on my research, did a lot more historical research at the War Memorial in Australia, and looked back at the discussions that had taken place prior to the establishment of the two military tribunals following the Second World War. And that was not an area that I'd looked at previously. And as we all know, that the research that a huge range of people did going back and looking through the archives has really contributed to our knowledge of what the Allies knew and what actually happened in the comfort station, because many of the Allied reports did have some information about that. I also want to acknowledge here Jan Raphael Hearn, because as you know, those of you in Australia know just how much Jan campaigned and how much she spoke, and she was such an amazing speaker. But one of the things, and this is my personal point of view, and I did speak to Jan a little bit about it, but one of the things that I think never received enough attention in the literature is the fact that Jan remains the only white woman who ever came forward. Now we know that there were other people, there were other Dutch women, but there were other women of other nationalities. And she is the only white woman who was willing to speak. And Jan knew that as a white person speaking about this issue would get publicity that might not have been available. And both the parochialism of Australian journalism, but racism clearly plays a role in some of this. And certainly the reporting in Australia focused so much on Jan and left out that broader context and did not always include stories from other women who had been affected by this. And so we all know that there was racism involved in the decisions not to prosecute people for what had happened to the comfort women back after the end of the Second World War. But that sort of racism continues sometimes in the intention and the way in which people end up reporting this issue, even till today. So I just thought both acknowledging Jan, but also highlighting that issue. And in addition to being the Day for Sexual Violence, this is Juneteenth in the United States, which marks the end of slavery. And obviously the proclamation of this as a public holiday in the US is very much about the fight against racism and the ongoing effects of slavery in the United States. But I don't think any of us are fooled by the fact that racism permeates all of our societies. And the other thing about Jan, which I know many of you are aware of, but just to highlight her courage, when she went to Tokyo that first time to talk about her experiences, she had not yet actually spoken directly to her children. She actually left behind a written manuscript for her daughters to read, but she also had not told anyone in her church. And as many of you are aware, Jan was a devout Catholic, and she had no idea when she went what sort of reception she would receive in her church. And some of you might know that when Jan was young, she wanted to be a nun, and that at the end of the war, when she confided to a priest what had happened to her, he told her it was best that she not become a nun. So that's sitting in the back of her mind, and she's got no idea what's going to happen when she comes back to Australia and how she's going to be received in her church. But happily, she was warmly welcomed, and people gave her an amazing amount of support after that. Now, that's the inspiration part of the speech, sort of, or the talk. I'm going to combine activism and legacy. And many of you are much younger than I am. And as Anna mentioned, this has been going on for well over 30 years now, because the initial research that took place in South Korea and Japan that led to Kim Hak-sun coming forward was really towards the end of the 1980s. And then by the 1990s, it's beginning to get some traction and publicity. But one of the reasons for approaching the ICJ was to try and get more international publicity and get what was a respected international human rights organization on board, so that people would take it more seriously around the UN and start focusing on it. But it is really important to remember just how many people were involved in this effort, and that it's those initial research and Kim Hak-sun coming forward that make other people in other parts of the Asia Pacific region do the research into their own countries. And then that becomes such, it's the scale of what happened that means it becomes such a major movement across the Asia Pacific region. And it's the scale of the work that was done, as well as the injustices, obviously, that were done within the comfort women system, that make this such an international issue at the time. But it is always, and I know you are all activists in your own right, but you can never underestimate what happens when a group of people come together, work with others, and work with others across cultures, across countries, and really are dedicated to a particular cause. And I would highlight here that for some of you, depending on what you've studied, you may not know that at the time the UN was being created, it's actually individuals and non-government organizations who fought for the inclusion of a human rights reference in the Charter of the UN. Governments didn't actually want that. And it was a sustained effort by those individuals in civil society that got it in. It's a sustained effort by civil society that leads to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I hate to say it, but at the time the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is being drafted and the Charter is being drafted, Australia, unfortunately, was a country that didn't want any reference to equality in there, because of course we're still in the White Australia policy days. So there is a very long history, and even if you go back to the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century, of civil society really pushing for change. And I think that that is an important thing to remember, because it also leads into what the comfort women have accomplished. And I think in this ongoing discussion about what Japan should be doing, people sometimes lose sight of what has in fact been accomplished. And part of my own personal view is that some reframing of this is necessary, because I think if the efforts are constantly focused on what Japan has failed to do, you're actually ceding power and control to Japan, because those discussions inevitably get into a circle of right-wing commentary in Japan and a denial of what happened. And so by focusing perhaps too heavily on what one state is doing, you're allowing a state to dominate rather than holding on to your power as civil society. And I think that's why I've tried to highlight in the last few talks I've given of all the things that have been accomplished as part of the Comfort Women movement, and the Comfort Women movement combining with other groups to make changes. So I'm going to go through a few of those items in the next part of my talk. So it is that combination of activism and legacy that I'm addressing. And the first is about that way in which civil society came forward and was able to make this an issue. And I've said this before, so some of you who've heard me speak before will know, and I've said it before, excuse me, that this is an issue that came out of the Asia Pacific region. This is not Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or even the ICJ going in and turning it into an international issue. This is groups in the Asia Pacific, often led predominantly by women, who turn this into something that the international community has to pay attention to. And I think, again, in terms of looking at this movement, that is an important thing, because too often issues around human rights are highlighted by organizations based in the US and Europe. And I think holding on to the fact that this came out of Asia Pacific and it's the hard work of people in the Asia Pacific region is something that people should take away and hold on to. Then obviously Anna's mentioned the Tokyo Women's Tribunal, and I'm happy to answer questions generally about the tribunal, but for today, one of the things I want to highlight is the fact that that tribunal is discussed extensively in the academic literature. And so it isn't just that the tribunal took place. It isn't just, and it is true, the people who did the research amassed an incredible amount of information. The depth of that information is extraordinary. But it's also the fact that it created its own legacy. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited to speak in London, where a tribunal had taken place looking at what had happened in Iran after the Shah was gotten rid of. And that the groups that organized that tribunal were well aware of the Tokyo Tribunal. And some of you may be aware that there's a tribunal going on now in London about the situation of the Uyghurs in China. And some of the people who were involved in that Iranian tribunal are also involved in this Uyghur tribunal, but they were well aware and researched and understood what a people's tribunal could accomplish. And so there is the tribunal itself, but as I said, it's also its legacy, and it's a model, not necessarily the pure legal way in which it was handled, but the amount of publicity and the way in which people can be given recognition and some sense of justice can be achieved through a people's tribunal, rather than constantly looking to a state to always give you justice. Because as we all know, states don't always give justice. And one of the things, particularly when we're looking at armed conflict, to hold in mind that the vast majority of perpetrators will never be brought to justice, because the world does not have the resources, human or material, to try thousands of people after an armed conflict. And so there is always going to be a need to search for alternate mechanisms of justice. Moving on from the tribunal, many of you are aware that because of the sustained efforts of civil society in the Asia Pacific region, that the UN, the then UN Commission on Human Rights and the then Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination Against Minorities both appointed rapporteurs to come and look at the situation. And of course, those documents remain out there in the public domain. But what's less well known is that the comfort women issue has come up in a range of other reports, including the report of the Special Rapporteur on Reparations. And although she this is the 2010 report, and it's come up since then a couple of times. Although she referred to the fact that the comfort women hadn't been successful in achieving reparations, that was not done in a negative way. She was trying to highlight the fact that the international community still does not have a way of monitoring and forcing countries to pay reparations, and that more needed to be done. And she actually looked at the range of harms that had happened to the comfort women as well as women in other situations of armed conflict to make her recommendations of what had to be done and the way in which a more gendered understanding of the effect of armed conflict on communities and women needed to be undertaken by the international community, and that the idea of reparations had to be broadened so that you were looking at women and the communities that women had to sustain at the end of a conflict, as well as the sorts of experiences that the comfort women had to endure and what you were going to do to help those women recover from their experiences. And we all know that they will never fully recover, but that at least more had to be done to help them reintegrate into their societies. And so there is that, again, ongoing impact of their stories, of the work that all those organizations and people did across Asia Pacific that have influenced the thinking. And it wasn't only in her report and the fact that these issues constantly are being discussed in the Human Rights Forum. When we were in Rome for the negotiations for the International Criminal Court, when you're at these international meetings, you can hold what are called side events. And so various organizations will invite the delegates to come along to a seminar, and there'll be a range of speakers. But so we held, some of us who were in what was the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice, who have been involved in the comfort women issue, held a seminar talking about the difficulties of reintegration after the war. So it wasn't just about what had happened during the war, but the ongoing psychological and physical effects of what had been done to them. And that discussion was aimed at helping to push for the creation of a substantial victims' rights unit within the ICC. And that was one of the successes of the need for a part of that organization to focus in on victims and the compensation for victims of armed conflict. Now, obviously, that victims unit can only work with groups and who have been affected since the creation of the ICC. It can't go backwards in time. But again, it's an important thing to remember as part of a success that maybe the women haven't achieved reparations from Japan, but they will have helped other women into the future to get a better outcome and to get a greater amount of attention. And in terms of, a general concept of justice, that one of the things that you want to do, and I'm not talking about straight legal justice, but moral, philosophical justice, is restoration of dignity, because we all know those ongoing sexual assaults ends up fundamentally affecting people's sense of their own self-worth. All you have to do is listen to even somebody who's subjected to rape or sexual harassment on just once in their life about the way that it's affected their fundamental self of sense, that this issue of creating mechanisms that help people regain their self-worth. And for me, reminding, and I know they're not a huge number of women alive, but reminding the women that they have in fact achieved so much, to me, is an important part of what those who are working with the women should be doing. That future generations will benefit from all the effort they put into highlighting their stories and what had happened to them. And the other thing that happened when we were in Rome was that for those of us who interviewed and worked with people who have been directly affected by the comfort stations, who had to live through the brutality of the comfort stations. There's no doubt that our lobbying of the government delegates was more effective than people who kept talking about it from a more abstract sense, because we could use case examples to highlight the sorts of issues that we were talking about. And when those negotiations began at Rome, the provisions, war crimes and crimes against humanity were not as strong as they should have been in that sort of gendered context. And that lobbying did lead to a better enumeration of the crimes, so that when you look at, I believe, I don't want to look down at my notes, but when you look at, I believe it's Articles 7 and 8, under the war crimes provisions, I think, anyway, you can look at it. And then again, under the crimes against humanity, there is a longer list, because as all of you are aware, the women who were forced into those comfort stations never liked the use of the term prostitution, enforced prostitution. And so the statutes now talk about sexual slavery, which they didn't going into Rome. And so they list both enforced prostitution and sexual slavery. And then there is a greater listing of the way in which sexual violence takes place. So it's not just a focus on rape or torture, it is a much greater list. And the same for crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity now includes the concept of persecution based on sex, which it had not going into Rome. So all of those changes, then you can't say that comfort women, that change, but what you can say is that their stories and our ability to relay their stories influenced delegates' willingness to make those changes and to make the statute far more progressive than it would have been otherwise. So to me, again, that's one of the things that needs to be highlighted more often than it has been, that these women can take credit for changes in international law, including international human rights law. And one of the other things, some of you are aware that the Women's Active Museum of War and Peace in Tokyo continually compiles a list of the various UN human rights bodies that have told Japan it needs to do more. So whether it's the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, whether it's the Human Rights Committee, or it's various parts of the International Labor Organization, they keep compiling a list, and they've also got that list of country parliaments, city councils, etc., that have called on Japan to do something and made their support for the comfort women known. I personally think that more attention should be drawn to the fact that all of these bodies have condemned Japan. And if you could find some magazines and newspapers in Japan that would print them, I'd be printing them on a regular basis, because this is not just the women, and I'm not trying to undermine the importance of them telling their stories, but it's also saying, here's this international body that's neutral, and it is telling Japan that it is violating its international human rights obligations by not making adequate reparations. And that in some ways means that the right wing can fight with the UN, but you are not fighting with the right wing, because inevitably all of these articles that end up being published about the comfort women, inevitably journalists go and find those right-wing politicians, and the articles end up including some of those crazy quotes from some of them. I don't know how many articles you can find that don't include some statements and quotes from that right wing of Japan, but I don't think there are many. And so trying to reframe this so that they don't get airspace, I think is an important thing to be thinking about. And the other thing, and again, this is a personal, I know that there have been efforts to include the documents from the tribunal as well as other documents into the UNESCO Memory of the World project. But there are very few people around the world who actually know that UNESCO actually has this memory of the world. And I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't happen, but after the Tokyo Tribunal, there was a discussion about trying to put some aspects of the judgment into simple language that ordinary people could understand, and also taking some of the evidence and putting that into simple language that ordinary people could understand. I still believe that that is a worthwhile exercise because that judgment remains relevant today in its discussion of a range of issues around international law, but also provides quite a good summary of what happened. And if it's put into simple language, it can be sent out across, again, the region. And there are countries in the Asia Pacific that don't have the resources. And whether we're looking at Indonesia or East Timor or Papua New Guinea, having simple language versions that can be translated into local language would help people to include it in their own education systems. So in terms of the lasting impact of this issue, it's wonderful that in South Korea, it's well known that the Korean community across the globe is well aware of the issue, but that's not enough. There are so many people who are affected by this that it, to me, is important that other areas in the region that were affected by it have access to material where they can educate their own populations, and this becomes part of their history. And Anna, I'm not sure you're doing a good job of telling me when my time is up.
I was going to give you a sort of, an indication maybe 5 minutes ago, but then I didn't want to stop your flow because what you were sharing with us were not only technically sort of insightful, but I think you spoke for us in the sense a lot of the political dynamics and a lot of the really tough issues to solve. You've just clarified some of the reasons as to why they are still important to work on and challenge, and some of the directions to which that we should look at to solve them. So you have given us so much in sort of the last half an hour or so. So we will let you pause, Tina, and catch your breath as well. And I will invite participants, attendees of the webinar to pose their questions by raising a hand or popping something in the chat. But as you do that, I will use my privilege as the moderator and just on that point of legacy and how this is an Asia Pacific centered issue, I just want to bring to everyone's attention sort of my personal question, or something that's in my mind since Jen Ruffle-Hearn's passing. And it is the story of a Sudanese Australian woman in Melbourne who was a victim of sexual violence back in Sudan before she became a refugee and resettled in Australia. And it is an incredibly sad story because this woman called Akon Guod, I think I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, I know. It's spelled A-K-O-N, surname G-U-O-D-E. And Helen Gardner, a well-known Australian author, wrote this column called Why She Broke, The Woman, Her Children and the Lake, after Akon drove her children into the lake with herself in the car at a breaking point of, I think, mental health issues, but also the trauma of sexual violence that was never fully adequately supported or healed. So unfortunately, Akon's children, some of them did die by her driving, the car into the lake. And she is serving a jail sentence at the moment. But for me, it really strikes at my heart at how this is a current and very alive issue, not something that has happened in the past and sits in a historical part of academia or legal scholarship. So with that, I think we are still recording, but we might stop recording, please, so that we can have